All right. So, AP, you're doing your presentations in class. So, this is a few of the revolutions. It'll be part one, part two, revolutions of 1820, 1830s. And then part two will be the revolutions of the 1840s. Now, this will be a quick overview. Some of this will touch on what some of your projects are, and I'm going to point out a few things so that you understand them. And we'll see more of this in the presentations that you do in class. So, here's where we're at. That growing isms that we've talked about. We had the presentations in class of the isms, and we talked about some of these isms, but these isms are going to spill over and start a reaction, that there's going to be a pushback as conservative ideas are fighting against liberal ideas. And remember, these liberal ideas were spread by the French Revolution and are now spreading because of this romantic ideas that are coming out of this time period. On the other side, you have conservatism, who wants to either affect change through traditional manners or want to return things to the stability that traditions such as monarchies and the church and social structures created. And they see these revolutions as a threat. After Napoleon, the Congress of Vienna had set up this Congress system, these alliances of these traditional states, these conservative states, to stop these liberal revolutions from happening. The problem is there's another concept that's forming at the same time called nationalism. And then we'd seen bits and pieces of it before this, but Napoleon, just as the liberalism was spread by the French Revolution and Napoleon, now we're seeing nationalism being spread by Napoleon, either in the fight against Napoleon or spread as a Napoleonic idea itself. So all of this is coming to a head, and that's going to result in conflicts. And here's the ones the big ones. One, you're going to see one in Spain, obviously. Then you're going to see one, obviously, in the Kingdom of the Italies, and a really large one's going to be in Greece. And then and then we're going to see one in St. Petersburg in 1825. We're also going to see one in other areas like in France, which the old adage, when France sneezes, Europe catches a cold, that there's revolutions everywhere. Even England is going to see a pushback. And this is one of the things we didn't have in the project, is that there's a repression of holding back and maintaining the status and interests of the wealthy landholding gentry. And we saw that with the passing of what we call the Corn Law. We'd sort of talked about this when we did the Gin DBQ, that same thing that we're seeing, that pushback against the lower class, that the wealth and power of the landed gentry is controlling Parliament. Well, this is that same kind of concept. Is the Corn Laws artificially raise the price on goods in England by increasing the taxes on foreign goods and foreign food. We're going to talk more about this when we talk about the Industrial Revolution and the potato famine. Add to it excise and income taxes that both wealthy and poor people paid. That's what they're pushing. But the problem is that the upper class paid these taxes, but the burden was heavier on the lower classes. And then on top of it, you're going to see um, a a push to maintain the social structure order where the upper class have the wealth and power. And this is going to lead to eventually a Chartist movement in England in the 1830s, which is then going to spill over into the 1840s and is going to cause some reforms to happen in England because of this. And this is what we're going to see when we talk about what happens with the Peterloo Massacre. And so what happened is these lower social orders, they want change, they want to have more rights to vote, and they want more representation. And then they have these mass meetings. All right, Liverpool then passes what they call the Coercion Act, like it says in 1817, that suppressed these ideas and outlawed these seditious gatherings, because they're seen, you have to understand that the upper class sees these lower classes meeting together as a threat to their political power and status. Well, one of these meetings we're going to see where it's going to boil over, and the Peterloo Massacre is where groups of these people mass together, these people wanting reform, and these early Chartists, and there was no law enforcement. So these private militias went and dealt with the issues with the protesters, and it turned violent. There were individuals that died. Um, like it says, 11 radicals are going to be killed, and this is seen as a black eye on English. One, it's seen as the higher upper class pushing back, and the fear in England was that Liverpool, the prime minister, had literally lit a fuse to what could spill over. That the fear was that if this were to catch on, it could lead to a revolution. So they passed the Six Acts, which basically restricts the flow of ideas, newspapers, and as you can see, they put in fines for sedition. They put trials, they sped them up for political agitators, all this. But what's interesting, this is the thing you have to remember. This is the part that is the nuance to England, is this one right here, the prohibition of training of armed groups, and it allowed local officials to search homes. One, this is going to lead to the beginning under Peel. Robert Peel is the prime minister that's coming, and Robert Peel is going to create something new based on what he saw coming out of France and other countries that deal with these revolutionary issues. The need for a law enforcement. And the original purpose of law enforcement in Europe was to maintain social order. That they were given swords and top hats, the early bobbies, law enforcement, named after him, obviously the bobby. Um, they had top hats and swords to show their position of power, but then they also wore tails to their uniforms to show the servant concept, and they mostly patrolled lower class areas, but they had power over upper class and middle class areas. They were meant to keep those people in their positions, but at the same time, they had authority over all English. And so that's the step forward. England, instead of cracking down and totally crushing these new revolutionary ideas, some of that they take one step forward, one step back. Yes, they outlaw the agitators, and they control meetings, and they increase the taxes on undesirable newspapers, making them unaffordable, much like we saw with Carlsbad decrees under Metternich. But at the same time, they outlaw these private militias that are owned by the wealthy and by the upper class. And they make a step towards, when we see later in the 1840s, the creation of this government police force under Peel, which then takes away that authority from the upper class. So they're addressing both sides. They compromise. Where you're seeing France, it's all or nothing. Either we're going to go radical or we're going the other direction. So that's what we're talking about. There's also plots to blow up cabinet with the Cato Street conspiracy. So there's this fear of radicalization, but England eventually is going to put in reforms. That's the thing, is England's basically doing what Burke said, that they're using the traditional structures in society of parliament, of the state, of the monarchy, to affect slow, gradual change, which allows that venting. You almost have to imagine like England's like a pressure cooker. And just about the moment it looks like it's going to blow and turn to revolution, something bleeds off that pressure. That they pass something like the Great Reform Bill in the 1830s, or later the other next Great Reform Bill in the 1860s. They're going to put in progressive ideas before America does, like laws on limiting child labor, and the Factory Act, which American factory acts are based on, come in the 1830s in England. There's that pressure valve that just about the time that the lower class is going to go into armed revolution, you're going to see that release. There's that valve that opens up that allows slow, gradual change to let this stop. You're going to see the same thing in American history too. And that's hence because we had a tradition of democracy that came from the English. So remember that. That's important. Latin America, the movements here, we're going to see a push towards liberating of these former colonies. We're going to see it in French Guiana and British Guiana. We're going to see it in Venezuela, Brazil. There is going to be a push to try to unify these areas and create kind of a United States of this. The most important one was obviously in Haiti. The revolt here with La Ouverture. He makes himself governor general. We got all that. And there's this pushback against the French Napoleon, but it's a rebellion between not just a slave revolt. It's also a revolt by the a cultural revolt. So yes, the Leo Overtures is a liberal revolution in Haiti. And at the same time, it's a into slavery too. So that's the liberal idea too. All men are equal. That it's a push away from imperial rule, but it's also the difference here in Haiti is that it's a social issue. That Haiti is also this fight against the Peninsulares who had more power over the Creoles who lived there in Haiti. So we're going to see in Latin America also Jose de San Martin is that led the independence movement in Chile and Peru, and Bolivar in Venezuela, and they become rivals to who there's going to free South America. Eventually, this ends up with both of them being forced out of power and abdicating. And the idea of an independent, liberated, unified Latin America dies with them. But this is an independence movement based on the liberal ideas of ending colonialism. Um, that's Bolivar. You gotta love the mustache. Mexico, we're gonna see it break away. Mexico is going to get independence from Spain in 1821, which then is going to run smack dab into America and its conflicts with Spain. Brazil with Dom Pedro, Brazilian Revolution there, ending slavery. You know the idea there of from breaking away from Portugal. They did preserve slavery there, though. That's not good. Now, someone here has in the group has Greece. We're going to quickly go through here and just hit the high point here. We're going to see a push from obviously Wallachia, Moldavia, places like that. There's a push for Slavic independence. But here, the Greeks, 1821. The thing you have to understand here, and we'll go through the people in the presentations will go through more detail of this. And you're going to see the Serbian independence movement that's starting that pan-Slavism that we're going to talk about in class. That was part of the ism projects. This idea that the Serbians wanting to push back this old tradition of pushing back against Ottoman rule and against Turkish rule goes back all the way to the 1600s. And now you're going to see this, and that's going to be a theme, even though the Serbians eventually will liberate themselves from the Ottomans. This is what's going to spark that same nationalism that causes World War One. This is also fed by the Russians. The Russians are Slavic, much like the Serbians and the other Balkan state cultures. And the Russians see this as a way of exerting their nationalism and their power. This is that threat to that balance of power that they want to spread and get their power into this area. And so they're using the Serbians and other areas as a way to extend their power. And we'll talk more about this as this fits into a more bigger picture that leads to World War One and then eventually into the Cold War. And this idea of this Eastern question fits into this idea of romanticism. There's a very heavy concept of pan-Hellenism, this idea that Greek culture, Greek ideas, because of romanticism that is flowing, which is weird that it fits in with the conservatives too, that they feel they are Greek, right? That they have this is our cultural root, and we have to stand up against these heathen Turks that are threatening this bastion of culture. And so you're to see, much like we talked about before, this balance of power thing is meant to stop conflicts from happening. Here, the balance of power actually is going to start a conflict in that the Turks are feeding this pan-Hellenism and feeding into the French and the British. And the Russians, of course, are doing this because they're Orthodox and their religion, they see the Turks as a threat. And so this is a whole thing that's being pushed. And then Greece is basically declared in 1830 with the support of Russian, French, and British troops that they gain their independence away from the Ottomans. And there's also another thing driving this is that the British and French know that if they weaken the Greeks in this area, they could then control the Mediterranean that the Ottomans had or trade that was coming through the Middle East. So this is also a goal not only to support Greek culture and Greek ideas, that we feel we're Greek as part of this whole pan-Hellenism, this idea of this enlightened romantic idea, but it's also a giant economic game of trying to take something away from the Ottoman Empire to increase the power of the British and French. And then the Russians, who did a lot of the heavy working, lifting in here, They think they're doing this to gain a foothold in the Balkans because of Pan-Slavism, and also they're trying to liberate a religion. And the one thing the Russians have always wanted is open to the Mediterranean. They need warm water ports because their northern coast is frozen for 6 months out of the year. And so by getting into the Black Sea, eliminating the Ottoman Empire, and being friends with the Greeks, not only this is a cultural, religious, but it's also an economic and power win for the Russians. The thing is, they get done over again. The treaty is signed in the Western states, and Greece quickly joins with the British and French after this treaty is signed. And they then side with the the Western powers. So it's a giant middle finger, and it starts this tension that's forming between the Russians and the French and the British. That's going to manifest itself later in the Crimean War. Lord Byron, big figure. We'll talk about him. Whoever does this project, Decembrists, we'll talk more. The groups will talk more about this. This is definitely a conservative issue, where they basically the idea is that a, a liberalist group want to force out the conservative czar by picking a liberal czar in the form of Constantine. And when this fails, Nicholas then um, purges violently the insurrectionists who want to stand up against. And this is his own army trying to do this, and he puts it down. We'll talk more about this in class. Poland, there's an uprising in Poland in 1832 that Poles of a nationalistic. So if this is a conservative liberal conflict in Russia, that the Poles then use the disarray of what's happening throughout Europe with all these revolutions and attempt to break away, right? To break away from the Russians and regain their own independence. And the Russians violently crush this because Nicholas is a conservative reactionary. And so, and this is, he's going to stand up to these ideas. And the Russians go in and they crush the nationalistic rebellion in Poland. 1830 revolts, we're going to see in Poland, Belgium, France. We're also going to see some in Central Europe and in Italy. In France, this one we covered in the presentations in class. The easiest way to basically explain this one to you is that you're going to see a conservative movement trying to maintain power with Louis XVIII, right? And he agrees to this idea of a limited government and all this. But then conflicts form over Charles X. Basically, Louis is going to be forced out by Charles, who wants to undo everything from the French Revolution. He wants to undo it, right? And he's on the far fringe here. And then that's going to lead to this whole conflict that's going to form and lead to a revolution between liberal ideas that Louis XVIII is moved, that they moved it more to the right. The liberals are going to push back. There's a revolution. Charles X comes to power. He goes over the top in the violence against these people, and he tries to undo the entire French Revolution. And they pass what they call the July Ordinances, which is basically they outlaw all the things that we saw in the French Revolution, the entire Parliament, strict censorship, and that led to the barricades and Les Miserables. The result is that he's drawn out of power, and we get an appointed king by the people. He's seen as the citizen king. He abolishes all these things, and Louis Philippe comes to power. We'll talk more about this with the presentations. And it turns out that Louis is pretty much the same thing as what we saw before. He's kind of a stuff. That's the gimmick here. He's a stuffed shirt. So, Belgium, this is the one I got to talk about with you guys. So basically, what Belgium is a nationalistic rebellion that with France is so busy tearing itself apart in the Revolution of 1830, and Poland is busy being smashed by the Russians because of their nationalistic uprising. No one's paying attention to the Belgians. And again, the player at the Greeks that you're going to see when we do the presentations in class is England. England's the big instigator here. Well, in this case, England again is the instigator. Belgium uses the opportunity of everybody being distracted to break away from France and France can't do anything to hold it. So, and here's the point why this is so important is that we talked about this whole Congress system and that the agreement was not to support liberal powers. But have you noticed that the conservative powers support liberalism and nationalism when it benefits them? In the Greeks, the Russians, the French, and the English backed a nationalistic movement, which is exactly against everything they're for, which is conservatism. In this case, you had a nationalistic rebellion that's forming liberalistic concepts, and you would think that England would come in and help France crush it. Instead, the English are the first ones to go over and welcome Belgium as a country and then supply them weapons to defend themselves at a cost. Let's make sure we point out at a cost. But it's their ideas of conservatism, their values are basically for sale. They're doing whatever makes it work best for them economically, politically, and socially. And so that's kind of the rub here, and that's why the concert is going to fail. This idea of these concerts and this balance of power is going to fail because everyone's out for themselves. England is mostly dedicated to what's outside of Europe, India and China, and they're using these upraisings to weaken their allies, which would be France and other conservative powers. That's how that works. And France, let's all admit, is a hot mess. Now, granted, we whizzed through that last thing there because obviously people are going to present in class to you guys. But France is a hot mess. It's yet to figure out how to create a stable government to address these ideas of liberalism and conservatism. So, and in England, this addressing what we saw with the movement of the Peterloo massacre, we're going to see England again makes a step forward and a step back. Liverpool, although conservative, realizes that this is not going to work. So here's England, who's supposed to be a conservative state that has a bit of liberalism, knows that if they keep going down this path, they're going to have a rebellion of their own. And so you're going to see this idea of economic freedom starting to come in, and there's going to be some permission of labor to organize. We're going to see the Catholic Emancipation Act, which allowed for Catholics to be in Parliament and passed to keep order in Ireland. What's the purpose here? They're basically preventing these revolutions. Like in Ireland, we're going, all right, we're going to let the Catholics come in as being members of Parliament now, and kind of go against that Test Act because we know that if we do this, we can stop the armed rebellion that's coming in Ireland. And then to deal with these rabble rousers who want liberal reforms, that they're going to expand the amount of electorates with the Great Reform Bill in the 1830s, which basically eliminated this idea of property and qualification. It grant, and we're going to see this idea of some suffrage coming towards women in the long run, right? But it didn't eliminate all property qualifications, and it's not going to give women the right to vote. We're going to see that coming. It's coming, all right? But you're not going to see those things eliminated right away. That's coming in the next reform bill. And of course, women are going to get the right to vote in the 20th century. Okay. So, but this is England trying here, right? They basically eliminate some of the things that held people from voting, like some issues of property, but they're not going to eliminate all. And so, what's the result of all these? The concert of Europe, you know, it's going to give some stability, but these liberal states or these conservative states that have a little bit of liberalism in them are going to make some gradual changes, like England, to stop off these revolutions. But it's not addressing the bigger issues. Like, it's not addressing the issues of revolution. In no way is addressing the issues of revolution. And almost all of these revolutions, to some degree, except for Belgium and Greece, failed. But did you notice why Belgium and Greece seceded? It's because they got support from another state. The fact that France and England and Russia supported the Greeks made it secede. Yet the English also helped the Belgians secede. In other areas, these liberal revolutions, like in France, the revolution of 1830 is just going to lead to the revolution of 1848. It's a failure. All right. The Poles, their nationalistic movement is going to fail. We're going to talk about some of these rebellions that happened in the 1840s in Italy and in the German states. They're going to fail in these nationalistic movements. but it's setting the stage for what's coming. It's pushing you towards this. So the revolutions are failures, but also the conservatives are failures in that they are just holding back what's going to come. Nationalism is going to be the driving force in the latter part of the 19th century. Liberalism is going to work its way into areas and gain more power. And England is the one that's stable because it's making gradual changes, little small little changes. And the other problem they're not addressing before we end this, the other thing they're not addressing is the economic issues, is that you have a growing factory working population that is falling farther and farther economically behind. And by giving some ideas of liberal rights, like you saw in this last slide here, down at the bottom, this they're allowing for kind of that release valve on the economic issues as well, but other states aren't addressing that. And there's going to be economic rebellions in places like France and eventually in Russia and in obviously in World War I. But not addressing the economic issues, the nationalism issues, and ignoring the liberal issues are going to be the downfall of many of these European states. And in England, you're going to see some of that addressing, and that's why England has more stability. Also, the fact they have a large economic base with the Industrial Revolution. All right, we'll give you part two of the Revolution of 1840 next.